They don't just pay them salary like employees, lower level employees. They have stock awards, or stock options, and the stock options alone, the reason why they give them stock options is so that they'll be motivated to work harder to increase their profits. When they increase their profits, share price go up. And the stock profits or stock awards alone was $30 million. $30 million. They also had his bonuses. His bonuses were $10 million. This is in 2020. Maybe in 2021, you even get more. Okay. Where was I? It's kind of crazy, Bremen. Which slide was I on?
Yeah, this slide. You're looking at the cost, agency costs, that they are high.
Now, there are three aspects to agency costs. Number one, the cost of monitoring. The cost of monitoring. That's also part of agency cost. So anytime you think of agency cost, we only think of maybe the compensation. The cost of monitoring is also part of agency cost. The owners of a company can establish a system for monitoring the actions and performance of management. An example of monitoring is the requirements for the directors to present an annual report and accounts to shareholders. Very, very important. So don't forget monitoring cost. Number two is it also includes the cost to the shareholder that arises when the managers take decisions that are not in the best interest of the shareholders. That's also a cost, right? If managers take a decision that is not in the best interests, that's not in the best interest of the shareholders, it comes as a cost to shareholders and the company. The third aspect of agency cost is costs that might be incurred to provide incentives to managers. So incentivization, and these are sometimes called bonding costs. So when we are looking at Satya Nadella's salary, that's what we call bonding costs, because the intention here is to reduce the size of the agency problem by giving him bonuses, by giving him stock awards or stock options. They are trying to reduce the agency problem so that he's able to act in the best interest of Microsoft. So you see, it says directors and other senior managers might be given incentives in the form of free shares in the company or share options. In addition, directors and senior managers might be paid cash bonuses. Do you see? So always remember that the salary is not, that's what we call a compensation. Number one is what? Salary. Number two is bonus. Number two is cash bonus. Number three is stock awards. So I just put a summary here: monitoring costs, bonding costs, and residual losses. Now, reducing the agency problem. Reducing the agency problem. Reducing the agency problem. Now, from what we, sorry. Okay. It's about to ask a question, but we have a lot to cover. So Jensen and Mecklin argue that When they act in the best interest of the shareholders, managers bear the entire cost of failing to pursue goals that are in their own best interest. Now, one of the ways you could reduce the agency problem is obviously the remuneration package, which we've talked about over and over again. Then you should also have a board of directors that will monitor, a balanced board that will monitor the decisions taken for the company by its executive. Now, the second point is having a large proportion of debt on the long-term capital structure of the company. Why do you think this reduces the agency problem? Does anyone have a clue?
So please the point again.
So I said there are several methods for reducing the agency problem, right? These include, right, number one, devising a remuneration package for executive directors and senior managers. Number two is having a large proportion of debt. Yes. Yes. Sorry, your line is breaking. So if you can type, that would be fantastic.
I think they have the large proportion of repayments not paid at all.
Sorry, could you repeat what you said? Could you repeat what you said?
So please,
No, it's still terrible. Can you type?
The loan, please, I was saying.
Can you type? Okay, I think Melody has. I don't know if she's still on the line. Does anyone have an idea why debt? Bosnia.
Okay. So when a company have a relatively large amount of debt, indirectly the banks becomes very, very, very interested in the activities of the firm because they would like to recover their money back. So they will have more or less a high influence or significant influence in the activities of the organization. So for instance, a bank, for instance, can give a high loan and say that, okay, the moment your share price falls below this, we'll have access to this asset and this asset and this asset. So here, then it means that the managers or the directors are then forced to maintain a certain level of performance.
Financial discipline, true. That's the whole point. So there's a pressure, when people give you loan, there's what we call covenants attached to the loan. That's what Caleb is talking about. And these covenants, they are tied around your financial performance and financial discipline. So these covenants alone will monitor you. So it's like the bank will monitor you. And obviously, there's also a pressure to meet interest payments, right? And again, the bank is monitoring that. If you don't meet your interest payments, you are easily exposed. You are easily exposed. So Melody says, because the repayments of debts are often non-negotiable in terms of the loan covenants. Fantastic. Fantastic. That's well put. Unlike equity, depending on the type of equity, dividend payments can be deferred or forfeited. Fantastic. Fantastic. Brilliant submissions. Yeah, so that's how you can reduce the agency problem. So the strategy paper is all about recommendations. That's why I'm taking pains to go through it. Last sitting, many students, a lot of students passed, a lot of students. Yeah. If you go through the past questions, go through the slides, know your models, we analyze the pre-sim properly, there's no way you wouldn't pass that exam. If you put in the work, you are likely, the chances are very, very high that you pass. Providers of debt, which is the banks, these banks. Jensen and Mecklin, they argued that the problems of the agency relationship are bigger in companies that are profitable, right? These companies generate a large amount of free cash flow. These companies generate a large amount of free cash flow. Free cash flow is cash that can be spent at the discretion of management. And does not have to be spent on essential items, blah, blah, blah. It is in the interest of shareholders that free cash flow should be either invested in projects that will earn a higher return or pay to shareholders as dividends. The directors and other senior managers of a company might want to also invest this free cash flow into projects. Basically, it's trying to explain what we are talking about when we are mentioning the large proportion of debts. We said one way of reducing this problem is to have a high proportion of debt capital in the capital structure of the company. Interest must be paid on debts. That was what Melody was talking about. Very, very good point. Melody and Caleb. Interest must be paid on debt, and this reduces the free cash flow. Management must also ensure that new investments are sufficiently profitable. So when there's a lot of debt, naturally there's pressure. People, you naturally have a lot of pressure to do things right. Now, let's look at the board of directors. The board of directors. So the first way of reducing, we are describing the ways of reducing the agency problem, right? We talked about that. Now let's talk about the board of directors. A different method of reducing the agency problem is to make the board of directors more effective at monitoring the decisions of executive management. Again, when we are talking about corporate governance issues, we said the board shouldn't be dominated by one person. The board will be ineffective at monitoring the decisions of management if it is dominated by one person. This is because the CEO is the head of the executive management team, right? So if the board is dominated by the CEO, then it's ineffective. The board will also be ineffective in the monitoring role if the CEO is also the chairman of the board. So Farmer and Jensen argue that an effective board must consist largely of independent NEDs. So who are independent NEDs? And one of the pre-sim materials we looked at, this was actually given as a recommendation. NEDs are people who do not have an executive role in the company, are not full-time employees. They are able to act in the interest of the shareholders. Very, very important. Now let's talk about accountability of agents. Agents should be accountable to their principal for their decisions and actions. Accountability means having to report back to principal, having to answer questions from the principal, and the principal having power to reward or punish an agent. Now, we talked about corporate governance, right? We can't talk about agency corporate governance without talking about ethics. You know, it's a whole ethical issue. There's an ethical undertone to all of this. Okay. So, agency theory may be summarized as follows. In many companies, there's a separation of ownership from control in a lot of companies. Individuals are driven by self-interest. Conflicts of interest arise between shareholders and managers. Managers are driven by self-interest and therefore cannot be relied to act on behalf of shareholders. And this is what creates problems. This is what creates problems. The agency problems create costs for shareholders. And the aim should be to minimize these costs by improving the monitoring of management and providing management with incentives that bring their interests closer to those of shareholders. Now, what I wanted to bring to your attention here is that there's an ethical aspect to agency theory. The theory is based on the view that individuals cannot be trusted to act in any way that is not in their own best interest. So that's the ethical side of agency theory. Now, I wouldn't want to touch a lot on agency conflicts in other types of organizations. I wanted to talk about the public sector. But we are all aware, right? We are all aware of how our public sectors run, especially in Ghana. Yeah. But there are some peculiar problems related to the governance of public sector organization. So in public sector organization, the principal is the taxpayer or the citizens, right? And their interest is value for money. The managers are the people who have been appointed, to manage the public sector institution. The problem that is peculiar in what do you call it? In public sector organizations is that the principal are a large number of individuals, different kind of individuals. Like we the citizens, we are the principals. We are and sometimes that heterogeneity or that differences between us and the fact that we are so many, it's difficult to come together to fight for something. Another problem in the governance of political sector organization is how to establish strategic objectives and monitor the success of the public sector organization in achieving this. So this, if you look at Ghana public sector institutions, it's easy to see some of these problems. You also have charities to the same thing, right? we said that charities, there will usually be a committee. The principal will employ the service of an agent. The agent could be a committee of trustees, and they are supposed to act in the best interests of the principal. So I wouldn't want to talk about all of that. Let's look at other theories of corporate governance. The agency theory of corporate governance is based on the view that the directors of a company are the agents of the company's owners, the shareholders. We've talked about this, monitor the directors and apply some control over them. I encourage directors to act in the best interests of shareholders. Now let's look at some of these theories, what we call the theories of corporate governance. Number one, the transaction cost theory. The transaction cost theory. That's the first thing, the transaction cost theory. Now, the transaction cost theory, it attempts to explain companies not just as economic units, but organizations consisting of people with different views and objectives. A large part of the theory is concerned with what makes an organization grow to the size that it achieves. How many operations does it undertake in-house, and how much does it buy in from external suppliers? So with the transaction cost theory, here we are looking more into, seeing an organization not just as an economic entity, but as consisting of different groups of people with different views and objectives. Now, from a governance perspective, the transaction cost theory is based on two assumptions about behavior. Number one is bounded rationality. And number two is opportunism. Bounded rationality, and number two, opportunism. Very, very crucial. Now, so the assumptions here are that human beings act rationally, but only within certain limits of understanding. This means, for example, that the managers of a company will, in theory, act rationally in seeking to maximize the value of the company for its share, but their bounded rationality might make them act differently. So bounded rationality sounds like a sophisticated term. I will call it limits to rational thinking. Limits to rational. So it's basically saying that in theory, we expect that, human beings will act rationally and say, oh, or somebody has employed me, so let me act in the interest of the person. But since we have bounded rationality, rationality that is trapped within certain limits, we do not do that. And managers might be expected to act differently as a result of that bounded rationality, or as a result of that limits to their rational thinking. Number two is opportunism. Individuals act in a self-interested way and with guile. In other words, people will not always be honest and truthful about their intentions, and will sometimes be opportunistic. So that's a transaction cost theory, right? So people are generally transactional. Like, why would you go to Cantonment? There was a time I went to Cantonment to buy something, and I negotiated, and the person said, oh, I think I said, I've forgotten the price, but let's say 3 cedis. I said, oh, 3 cedis. I said, okay, you take it. Now, at the point of, so the thing I saw, right? And I said, okay, I want this. Let's negotiate on it. 3 cedis, final price. When I had turned my head a little bit, he apparently changed it with a low quality one. He changed it nicely with a low. So when I got home, I checked. I was like, this is not what I chose. So people are guided by guile. So people are opportunistic and might take advantage of. That's the transaction cost theory. Then you have the stewardship theory. In the stewardship theory of corporate governance, it's recognized that directors of a company have a stewardship role. So you know what stewardship is, where they are acting in the interest of another. They are acting as agents. They are supposed to protect the assets of the company and manage them on behalf of shareholders. So that's what we mean by steward, a steward. Then you have the resource dependency theory. Resource dependency theory looks at how resources of an organization affect governance and behavior. So what is the argument of this theory? Organizations depend on resources. Resources are a basis of power. Resources are a basis of power. Resources are a basis of power. So resources affect the way an organization is governed, right? It affects the way an organization is governed. And we see that in Africa, where there's a lot of resources, and you see that the governance, it seems that it's other people that are taking advantage of us and governing us. Resources are a basis of power. Again, power and dependence on resources are directly linked. So that's the resource dependency theory. Then you have the managerial hegemony theory and class hegemony theory. I already want to, I'll touch on it quick and we move on. Class hegemony theory is a Marxist theory that considers the business elite as a group of individuals who control the governance of companies to perpetuate their power base. So this is a theory, right? Where there's an elite. I don't know if you've heard this whole theory on So I don't know if you've heard this whole theory of an elite group of people, even this corona thing, right? There's this whole rumors or conspiracy around an elite group of people controlling the world. So class hegemony is quite similar, where there's considered to be an upper class or an elite. When we say an elite, these are an upper class of people, right? Or a group of individuals who control the governance of companies. Managerial hegemony is quite similar in that sense, right? It's quite similar in that sense, where it says that real power is in the hands of management and they can take advantage of it to pursue their self-interest. Then you have psychological and organizational perspective theory. Psychological and organizational perspective theory. A psychological perspective theory takes the view that governance depends largely on informal structures and behaviors within an organization. So decisions by a board of directors and the performance of the board are influenced by interpersonal relationships. So it's more of a bargaining process between interested parties. That's why in some organizations, people say there's a lot of politics here. So it's more of interpersonal relationship, like a bargaining process, interpersonal tactics. That's what people describe that, hey, this organization, there's a lot of politics, so, because it's based on interpersonal tactics, interpersonal relationships and all that. They have the stakeholder theory, the system theory. The stakeholder theory of corporate governance is that governance depends on the interrelationships and the relative strengths of the different stakeholders of the company. It's quite explanatory. Then the system theory approach to governance considers a company as an overall system. This one is a very, very meaningful theory to me, in my opinion. And it says that governance depends on how these different systems link with each other. It sees an organization as different parts of a system. So a system theory approach to governance considers a company as an overall system. So a system is something that has different parts. And governance depends on how these parts or these systems are linked with each other. Very, very important. Let's talk about Ghana's Code of Best Practices. And then we'll talk about the principles-based and the rules-based corporate governance, and then we'll call it a day. Ghana's Code of Best Practices has 6 main sections. Number 1 is the mission, responsibilities, and accountability of the board of directors. Number 2, the committees of the board, or the board committees. Number 3, relationship to shareholders and stakeholders. Number 5, financial affairs and auditing. Number 6, disclosures. Number 7, code of ethics. So these are the 6 sections. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sorry, I think I said the number wrong. Number 1, mission. Number 2, board committees. Number 3, the relationship to shareholders. Number 4, financial affairs, disclosures, code of ethics. Now there's something we call principles-based and rules-based. Listen, you need to go in the exams knowing this. This means that when we say something is principles-based, it means that they consist of a number of core principles or guidelines or provisions. So principles-based is more focused on guidelines or provisions. Please remember this. When we say rules-based system or rules-based corporate governance, it means that it's backed by law, it's backed by regulations. Principle-based, backed by guidelines. Rules-based, backed by laws and backed by regulations. And what you need to know is that Ghana's code is not rules-based because it is a voluntary code. Remember, we said that it's an optional code. However, it does not set out any corporate governance principle. So you can describe it as a voluntary set of indicative rules. It's more of like a voluntary set of indicative rules. It seems to tilt a lot more towards, I can't say it's principle-based too, because it does not set out any corporate governance principle, but it's definitely not rules-based because it's voluntary. So the best description of it is that it's a voluntary set of indicative rules. Any questions? Any questions?
No, sir.
Okay. If there are no questions, then let me see. If there are no questions, then we'll call it a day for today. We have a lot more. Yeah, we'll call it a day for today. So I need to wrap up with a couple of things. Again, I'll repeat again. Please go through the past questions. Don't wait till the pre-seen material comes before you start. Otherwise, you'll be overwhelmed. Go through the slides. Go through the recordings, and you should be definitely fine. If you haven't sent me your assignment and you'd like for me to review the assignment, you can always send it to me too as well. So thank you very much. If there are no questions, then we can end the class now.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, seems there are no questions. Okay, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.